side?
Yeah.
From the stairs?
Buonasera, signore e signori, benvenuti a Italia.
I'm not going to
That's as far as I'll go with my Italian. By the end of this trip, I'll have a little bit more Italian up my sleeve, I'm sure. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Democracy and Culture Foundation, and gosh, so many familiar faces in this room. Sheikha Mayasa Mareva, Irina Bokova from our chair of the Democracy and Culture Foundation, Ernesto Neto, Jana Peel from Chanel, Susie Menkes, it's been a while. Well, George Sikovaris, my better half, and my beautiful niece, Melina Perez. So I have to put in a plug for my fan club. But there's some new faces as well. There's Ibijoke Faborode from Nigeria. There's Zankan from...
Adriu and Lapsley.
That's right.
Lapsley.
And Lapsley, you have a surprise for us later on. So just a few names, just to show the variety of the people that are joining us from all over the world, just to share some very important insights. And, you know, we're gathered in this absolutely beautiful room to answer one question. Can the arts be a way out? Ladies and gentlemen, our world, our society, our democracy is battered by multiple crises. And I'm not just talking about COVID and this senseless war in the Ukraine, but there are more permanent crises. There's the cancer of inequality, there's the existential threat of climate crisis, there's the migration and demographic flows that are really shifting the tectonic plates of geopolitics, and there's that really fast pace of technology. I'm still trying to work out what NFTs are and how AI is going to impact art and whether our institutions catch up with technology. We'll be talking, these are the type of things we'll be talking about here. So can the arts really be the way out for this? Sheikha Mayasa, I'm going to quote you where you said a few years ago in Berlin, I think it was, art is a universal language. Culture brings people together. It makes us think in a very different way. It moves us. It makes us more creative. And, you know, it gives us more freedom in our thinking. And maybe it encourages us to think of alternative solutions to the problems that our world is facing. So can the arts save the world? I believe that yes, maybe it can. These are the themes that we are talking about over these 3 days. They are very close to the Foundation's heart, the interplay of society and the arts. The nexus of culture and democracy is what we're all about. And Kim Conniff-Tabor, our talented, I should say multi-talented editorial director, who has served both culture and democracy, has weaved a fantastic program, along in consultation with our journalists from the New York Times. Matt Anderson is here, the European culture editor, Farah Nageri, Rosalind Sulkus, our culture writers, Scott Rayburn, he's a writer for the New York Times, but also for the Art newspaper. Yorgos Archimandritis, author and TV and radio host, and Yelena Turkuya from Qatar Museums. So tell us, Kim, a little bit about what we're going to hear these 2 days.
Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the program, but before I do that, I really wanted to thank Achilles and also the entire Democracy and Culture Foundation team for making this possible. So happy to see you all here, and happy to see this finally coming together after a lot of hard work. So as many of you know, Art for Tomorrow began as a New York Times conference back in 2015 in Doha, under the patronage of the strong support of Qatar Museums. It wouldn't have happened without Qatar Museums. And after several years in Doha, the event traveled to Berlin, and then last year we were in Athens, which is also home to the Athens Democracy Forum, another of our suite of events at the Democracy and Culture Foundation. And so, as Achilles, who was the head of conferences at the New York Times, saw these conferences come to fruition year after year, he was very gratified, but he also started to get a little bit, I would say, frustrated. I don't want to speak for you, but a little frustrated because so many amazing ideas came out of these events, but there was really no mechanism for following them through, for following up on a conversation or a project or something that was catalyzed at these events. So that was the vision behind the Democracy and Culture Foundation and why the foundation was created several years ago. So this leads me to the program. Those of you who have been following Art for Tomorrow for a while, you may have noticed a few changes in the last couple of years, and that's totally intentional. When I'm conceiving the program, I'm really striving to align it with the values of our foundation. So the goal of the foundation is to help democracy evolve. So this could be through things like highlighting the role that museums play in their local and global communities. It could be looking what course corrections still need to be made in promoting the work of women. You'll hear about that tomorrow. It could be taking a critical look at heritage issues, which we'll also hear about tomorrow, or considering how digital art and public art are raising awareness about the climate crisis. Or, as we'll see later tonight, it could be showing how public and private sectors can work together to further the impact of the arts.
Well, talking about these sectors, there's some more people I'd like to thank, apart from our speakers and our audience, all of you, of course, coming from all over the world, our sponsors. And I'll have to start with Her Excellency Sheikha Al Magassa bin Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani. You always smile when I do that, but I have to say it once, and it's out of the way. It's been many years. Qatar Museums and the chairperson of Qatar Museums have really been a driving force for this conference. Our founding supporter, Qatar Museums, undeniably an innovator in the art space, so we're very happy to be continuing this journey with you here in Italy. Brunello Cucinelli, if there is a brand that epitomizes heritage and craftsmanship, and has an owner, by the way, who really shares the same values that we have on humanism and social impact, it's Brunello Cucinelli, our headline sponsor. And other sponsors like Ruina, Qatar Hospitality, Qatar Creates, the art newspaper, Palazzo Strozzi, where we're going a little bit later on today, and this wonderful hotel, the St. Regis and Westin, who have been absolutely wonderful to give us their hospitality. So a round of applause for our sponsors, because they make it happen.
So we also just want to remind you to be sure to post frequently about the event. Our handles and hashtags, you'll see them in the back of the room, in the program, so make sure to tag us, tag each other. And then now, without any further ado, the program is going to kick off with a fantastic panel led by Rosalind Silkis, a culture writer at the New York Times, that's going to debate whether and how culture can provoke reactions. And this morning I was getting ready for our many meetings today, listening to a podcast, and of course heard about the death yesterday of Harry Belafonte. I heard a quote that he once said, which I think really speaks to all of the themes that we're promoting here at this event. He said, "I was an activist long before I became an artist. They both service each other, but the activism is first." So with that...
We'll hear from the minister first.
Oh, the ministers?
Yes.
They had told me that you weren't here. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. But first, before this panel, we're very lucky to welcome the Deputy Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Maria Tripodi.
Thank you. Dear President of the Democracy and Culture Foundation, dear Sheikh Mayassa, authorities, dear friends. It is a great honor to address the audience of the 2023 Art for Tomorrow. I wish to thank and commend the organizer of this initiative that takes place in Florence for the first time. Florence, the art capital of the world, is indeed one of the best places where to rethink, from the cradle of the Renaissance, the new landscape, and the potentialities of the art for tomorrow. In this challenging time, we wonder if arts can be a way to revitalize society on the basis of shared democratic values. Looking at the paradigm offered by Florence in the past, we all know the central role that art and culture played in forming the process that led to political liberties of modern time. This is the reason why today a key mission of the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs is to promote our inestimable cultural and linguistic heritage abroad through the network of Italian cultural institutes, embassies, and consulates, while at the same time engaging in multilateral fora, firstly, UNESCO, to promote culture and the cultural pluralism, and to protect and preserve the world cultural heritage. To live and work surrounded by arts is a privilege not many can afford. It stimulates the mind, it helps to focus. In this perspective, we, the Italian Minister on Foreign Affairs, feel very privileged. The Farnesina Palace hosts a collection of contemporary art that narrates the evolution of Italian artistic tendencies in the 20th and 21st century, including the most recent means of artistic expression, like digital arts, graphic and street art. Currently, the exhibition The Great Italian Vision, that presents a selection of the best pieces of the Farnesina collection, is touring Asia with the great success. Throughout that history, art and culture, connecting people and bridging divide, have proved to be a fundamental for dialogue, inclusion, reconciliation, and peace. Within the current challenging international context, art and creativity have the potential to rediscover and better our civic engagement at a local, national, and international level, shaping a new vision of future for society and communities. Recent global transformation, digital, climatic, pandemic, have also prompted us to boost our efforts, supporting the role and action of international organizations acting in the field of culture and education. In Florence, we organized the first ever G7 Minister of Culture in 2017, and on the occasion we sponsored an appeal adopted by UNESCO on culture and the cultural pluralism as a strategic tool for peace. That paved the way to the Rome Declaration of the G20 Minister of Culture, adopted on July 30, 2021, under the pertinent motto, "Culture unites the world." In times where, sadly, conflict and war are back, even at the core of Europe, Florence proudly reaffirms itself as an urban laboratory of humanism for centuries, a laboratory where the value of war past, combined with a shared vision of innovation and progress, is intended to be a way of remaining a possible common futures. I thank you for attention, and I wish we all a productive session. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I be here? Thank you. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be in Florence, the birthplace of so much art and culture that we've revered over the centuries, and to be talking about culture with all of you. Let me introduce my panel. On my right is Shu Kalmana, a Qatari visual artist who works in painting, sculpture, and installations, and focuses on Qatari culture and identity, and the idea of art as a pathway to greater social and cultural awareness. On her right is Ibijoki Farabode, the founder and CEO of Elect Her, which is a non-partisan organization that advocates for greater political representation by women across Africa. She told me that in her home country of Nigeria, culture is one way to have complex conversations around cultural and religious barriers that might otherwise inhibit or prevent women from attaining their objectives. On Ibijoki's right is Holly Lapsley-Fletcher, who is an independent musician, singer, and songwriter, who sees herself as communicating the human experience through her art and has been a climate change activist for many years, both through her music and in other ways. Last year, her track, The Resolution Song, written for Earth Day, was nominated in a new Grammy category, Songs for Social Change. Before I turn to the panel and start asking them deeply probing questions, I'm going to quote a passage written last year by the author Hanya Yanagihara. She writes, "We are currently in a moment in which art is often expected to say something about the various urgent injustices that define our world. And not just to say something, but to be a conduit for change. That has led to some provocative and moving work, proof that sometimes art can do what policy cannot. Shift public perception and provide an emotional entryway into a problem that can feel either abstract or intimidatingly complex, or both. But, Yanagihara adds, there is no one way to be an artist. Point I'd like to come back to later. As she points out, the visual arts, as well as theatre, dance, music, opera, multidisciplinary interactions, abound with work about pressing social issues, which some of which Achilles spoke to a little while ago: climate change, the environment, systemic racism, migration, human rights, gender issues. The list is very long. But I'm hoping we'll explore, at least to some extent, a bigger issue here, which I'll put more simply than the sort of lengthy blurb on the program. Does any of it actually help anything? Can art effectively change anything in our world? Does it matter when we're facing huge global crises like we did with the pandemic? Does it shape public discourse? Can it lead to social or political change? We're going to answer all those questions in the next 20 minutes. Ibijoki, perhaps we can start with you, since in fact your work is not directly a cultural domain, but as I mentioned, you have spoken about the ways in which culture has been immensely helpful to you in achieving some of the things you'd like to achieve. Can you speak a little bit more about that and explain some of those interesting projects that you told me about on the phone?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hello. Great. I want to feel like I'm not talking to myself. Yeah, great. So I'm not traditionally from the art space. In fact, my job is to get women into politics and get them elected. And that's because less than 5% of our legislators are women in Nigeria, because half of our population are women. So we don't have a choice, as to how decisions are made in my country. Conversations around politics can be very complex, they can be very overwhelming, and they can be very heavy. And to be honest, I feel it. Sometimes I'm speaking with my friends, and once I, go into the technical policy-related stuff, they just switch off. They want to talk about food, about culture, about wine, about fashion. And so how do we intersect this? And I think that's when we started to look to the arts. So one of our thematic areas really is arts and special projects. And we do that through exhibitions. In fact, we just concluded one of the most anticipated elections in Nigeria. And for most of you that do not know, Nigeria is a country of over 200 million people, so you can just imagine the political landscape. Now, I mentioned earlier that women are underrepresented, and one of the ways that we thought to spike things up a little bit was to actually create an art exhibition and also a fashion collection to fundraise for the women. Because I thought, I used to work for the British government. I thought when I quit my job, I was going to do this amazing work, fundraise for women. I'm going to tell everybody about the good role, why women should actually be a functional part of society. And I started fundraising, and I couldn't raise funds. I'd done the social media campaign, I'd spoken to my friends, but they were just not interested. It wasn't really connecting with them. But one thing happened. We decided to bring together a couple of artists to really create art pieces about the role of women in society and how they intersect with it. We put together an exhibition, we put together a fashion show, and we were able to fundraise money. So out of 8 of my candidates, 3 actually got elected this election. So art resonates everything. Art, really brings to the fore a lot of things that are unspoken. Politics is art itself. All art is politics. And I feel like sometimes in the complexity of the conversation, art is really a way to bring it on, because with art you can feel, you can visualize, you can have difficult conversations by just staring. I mean, this room alone says a lot. There's a lot of history in this room, and I think that's why everyone is here to intersect. So for me, while I'm not traditionally from the art space, I feel art lives in me. As a Nigerian as well, we have decades and decades, generations of history, and really history says that women have been relegated. That's the oral history. But the truth is that women in Nigeria were actually very strong nationalists, pre-independent. They were strong socio-economic and political figures. Unfortunately, over time, the story has been retold that women were relegated and women were not as powerful. And so my job is really to say, we need to reimagine this. We need to correct the historical oversight, and that's why arts and special projects really is a very core part of the work that we do. Yeah.
So you're saying art effectively allows people to reread certain social
Absolutely.
or cultural contexts.
Absolutely.
Shuk, I wonder if I could turn to you and ask you about that, because you are working as an artist, a female artist in Qatar. It's a pretty patriarchal, historically, a pretty patriarchal society. Do you feel that just by the virtue of being a female artist, you are in effect an agent of change, that you are a model for younger women, perhaps, or for other female women who would like to be artists?
That's a great question. Thank you, Rosalind. And thank you, Art for Tomorrow, for inviting me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be speaking amongst everyone. Answering your question, I think we've had a lot of role models, female role models in the industry. And I believe it's a generational thing. And we've been learning a lot from them. For example, we have Sheikha Mayasa, we have Sheikha Moza, and so many more people working in the UN. And I don't think it's a barrier. No.
A barrier?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a powerful thing, and it allows me to express myself through art and showcase my culture and heritage to the world.
Do you have some of the same issues to deal with in your art that Ibijoki is describing? In other words, there are certain ideas or sort of cultural contexts that are easier to address through art than they are to simply raise as an issue.
To answer to your question, I think I aim to utilize cultural symbolism in my work, and as it's a cultural symbolism and showcase culture and heritage, as well as unity and identity throughout my work, I don't think so. I think, as I said, it's a generational thing, and preservation of heritage as well.
Thank you. Holly, let's give you some attention. You've obviously been very socially conscious since the beginning of your songwriting and music career. How important is it to you? Is it a motivating factor in what you do, or is it simply natural to you?
It's interesting. So I grew up with a father that worked in sustainable development and was constantly traveling around the world, but alas, quite an absent father. And so I'd get nuggets of information when he came back talking about his time in Uzbekistan or during some big flood catastrophe. And then on the other side, in the domestic space, my mum was playing Joni Mitchell. And I think about the impacts of, well, I'm coming at it, everything from a music perspective, by the way, which is my lane. I think about the impact of certain songs that were played in the immediacy and how they've ricocheted through time and linked to what I do now and linked both my parents together and their work.
It's interesting you mentioned listening to songs, because when you were telling me about the song that was nominated for the Grammy, you were saying that it had been sung by, did you tell me, over 200 different artists?
In 200 different countries.
In 200 different countries?
Yeah, including Annie Lennox has performed it. I wrote down some facts because
and so I'm wondering what you think. You know, people sing the songs. They say, I don't know what the words are, but I presume they are about the issues that Earth Day would focus on. Do you think that simply by absorbing the ideas of lyrics and so on, that can actually make for meaningful change?
I think a common misconception about music is that it's escapism. And particularly with the Resolution song. So I got given a brief that came on my desk that week, which was to write an activist song for Earth Day. And I get a different kind of brief every week. Sometimes it's an advert, sometimes it's for a massive pop artist. And I think we underestimated the impact that this song would have. I purposely went for something that was incredibly simple and a bit of an earworm, is a word that we like to use, but very directly depicts some of the issues that we have with our attitude towards climate change. I think a lot of music is to do with changing attitudes rather than it's the attitude that creates the physical change. So it's planting seeds in that sense. So the Grammy nomination was a great surprise that we had.
So are you saying that awareness has to start somewhere, and that it can be as basic as repeating a song's lyrics?
I think it depends. I think with music, you have an immediate reaction to the song, and most of us listen to music in quite like a private space. There's an immediate reaction, which is effectively showing a mirror to ourselves or shining a light on something that was previously in the dark, emotionally, consciously, within the personal space. But then beyond that, there's the place of a song over a long period of time, and when it's spread between people, and the passing on of a narrative of a story and the awareness. And something that I thought, before you get into the deeper analysis of some of these ideas around climate change and solutions, I think awareness is still quite a primary important thing, and this song served as a song about awareness rather than, I guess, a solution.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ibijoki, you talked about the sort of practical help that culture was for you in terms of fundraising and being able to talk about issues. But to our fundamental question, does it actually make a difference in terms of changing people's ideas? Have you seen practical consequences of the cultural activities that you've engaged with for your organization?
Yeah, actually, so there's a pattern in the political space. I mean, I'm not a politician, but I like to think I'm a kingmaker. Well, I'm becoming a kingmaker. Sometimes we have conversations amongst ourselves, and the truth is that other people, a lot of non-conventional people, can really understand, or they're hearing you, but they're not listening, and that's it. So our communication can sometimes be tone deaf. So you go into this room and you talk about, the deep policy issues, you're being very technical, but the next person can really translate it, But what we found out with a lot of the creative, art-related or cultural events that we have is people get to think, people get to interact, people get to communicate. There's that incremental behavioral change that you can almost notice because narratives are being shaped. People are rethinking and reimagining the way they thought things were, and that's the beautiful thing. So we have an annual exhibition
I was about to ask if you could give us a concrete example that perhaps what you're about to do. Yeah.
So we have an annual exhibition called Obìnrin. Obìnrin in my language means woman. We actually started it during COVID. It was in 2020. And at that point, I honestly didn't think that people really cared about what we had to say. And so we thought, the world is in a dark place, people are dying of COVID, we just needed something to boost people up. But we also knew that, there was a socio-political reality and context in the country. And so we put up this art exhibition, and I was quite skeptical because it was the first time we were dabbling into that. But I think 30 minutes after we started, the room was filled up. It was the first time I actually felt I was connecting with people. And the interesting thing was that we were talking about the same thing we've talked about for the past year, which is politics, the role of women, just that people could intersect and understand in different ways. Now you have those art pieces that were very interactive, they were very thought-provoking, and people were asking questions, and through that, we could then relate it to the evolution of women in society, the role that they played. And I think for me that was very pivotal. Now, before that event, so my country is quite funny, or maybe some other countries are same as well. A lot of private sector players that have the economic power would not really dabble into a space just because of the kind of political economy we run. So they don't necessarily want to be seen as anti-government. So they would rather, they say they're apolitical, but the truth is that they would rather not talk about politics or democracy. They just think democracy and politics means you're partisan, and they wouldn't really want to lose, government affiliation or favors or whatever it is, right? Or policy-related things. Now, we had a lot of top business executives in that space. And the interesting thing was, I think our first sponsorship after that event was from a very peculiar private sector player that would never really be interested in that sort of conversation. And for me, that really proved that conversation, was very meaningful and very impactful. Plus, we had influencers, celebrities, artists, so many people in the space, but they could come there because there was a point of intersection, which was not the traditional conversation. So we've seen a lot of that. I mentioned that earlier this year we had an election, and when the traditional fundraising and crowdfunding wasn't working, because in my country, so I don't know how many people are conversant with Big Brother, no? It's a reality show. Well, so it's the biggest reality show in my country. I think people actually spend billions of naira voting. It's crazy. But then I wanted to fundraise for women to run for office, and I was really hurt. No one was fundraising. No one was giving us money. And I think, but I wasn't hurt actually. It made me really realize what people connect to. People connect to what they can see, feel, touch, and what really intersects their immediate reality, and Big Brother does that for them. And so when we put together the fashion show and people could actually wear the shirts, we were able to raise money. And so each day, I learned that sometimes what we think that a solution is might not necessarily be the solution. And for us, it's now a very pivotal part of our work. The Oberyn exhibition we started in 2020, we had it last year, and we've taken a break for a year. And so next year, we want to turn into a Pan-African exhibition, because we believe that it's one thing that can really intersect the whole of Africa together to talk about the role of women, politics, and their influence in society as well. So we've seen the art is really a way out. We've seen that arts can transcend time and places and shape conversation. And I've really seen it in the line of work that I do. And I'm more than, interested and committed that I know that it's the way forward for us to really, keep going, in that way.
Holly, what about you? Do you feel like you've seen concrete instances of change brought about by either your work or other people's work?
Yes. My second album, which is called Through Water, I talk about, it's like a cross-section between talking about being submerged in water in a metaphorical sense, being a young person facing the pressures of climate change and mass migration that's going to happen due to the environment, and just all of the pressures of the future that seems to weigh on our heads as young people. And I try to weave that alongside the very literal effects of right now, the biggest effects of climate change being felt through water. So I talk about that album as an emotional response, but the first track of the album talks about the very literal problem that's happening. And I open the album with a speech that my dad gave. And the opening line is, "The majority of effects will be felt through water." And I recorded the entire speech in the bathroom with all the water running and sampled it within the work. And that track was then performed at World Water Week. And then it was, from there, I guess similar with the Resolution song, it kind of ricocheted into the world and had this place within activism. And there isn't many examples of a cross-section between water and highlighting climate change.
Yeah. Shuk, what about you? You talked to me about some of the work you did for the World Cup, where you used traditional symbols of male Qatari headgear, and you said you felt like there was a cultural exchange happening, that you were helping people to understand more about your culture. I mean, do you think there is increased tolerance, increased capacity to understand other people's cultures that come from this kind of work?
I think art is a way out for me, is showcasing my culture to the world, and that culture exchange builds bridges. And I think that's a powerful thing. The culture exchange, for example, during the World Cup, a lot of visitors came in, they wore the agal, they took pictures with it, and they contacted me and asked me about what it means and how to wear it. And there was an incident, actually, I remember, during the World Cup. I was on my way to the seat in one of the football matches, and a Mexican fan approached me and my brother. He was interested in wearing the ghitra and agal, but he couldn't find any. So he asked my brother if he could wear it. So we gave him the ghitra and agal, and once he wore it, he felt very welcomed, and he felt part of the culture. It made him part of the culture, and it made him not just feel different, it made him feel Qatar in a way. So we asked him what is the most interesting thing you saw here in Qatar, and he said that the generational aspect of how the father and the son and the mother and the daughter are wearing the same thing and acting the same way. It felt very family oriented in a way, and in exchange we kept his sombrero and he kept our agal and ghitra.
Nice. I want to, we haven't got much more time, but I want to come back to the line that Hanya Yanagiri writes after writing about the ways in which art can take up social causes and can be a conduit for them. And she finishes by saying, I'm not remembering now the exact phrase, but an artist can do anything. An artist has the right to do anything. So my question for all of you is, should artists today be trying consciously to address social ills? Do we have do they have a moral, or do you have a moral imperative to do this? We've only got about 3 minutes, so just very quickly from each of you, brief thoughts on that topic.
I think having that awareness means that it can then be used as a tool. I think I accidentally fell into it. I think my early work was definitely looking at the past, looking internally, but focusing a lot on the past. And then as my work progressed, the more I looked inside, the more I realized there was a connection with an anxiety towards the future. And therefore, speaking within my personal work about my own anxieties had this link with the bigger picture. And therefore, it's interesting because I've just finished a European tour and I had so many people come up to me and tell me so many specific examples of how certain songs have affected them in their life.
Well, I mean, I'm not an artist, so I wouldn't speak for an artist, but what I would say is that I think every human has a responsibility to leave the world better than they met it. And I think it's on that premise that, everyone should do their bit. I wouldn't necessarily say we should put the pressure on artists, being artists, to use the platforms to, push for social consciousness. I think there has to be the believability of it. They need to believe and leave it first before they can interpret it. But what I find from the very limited perspective of art, that I know is that you have to feel something to be able to express it. Most artists feel very deeply to express. I used to paint, although I've had a block for like 3 years now. I think because of work I haven't really painted. But I know that, it was just things I wanted to express that I would just put on a canvas, and if it made sense or not, it was a function of my society, my environment, what I was feeling deep inside, conversations that I had. So I think every artist has it in them. It's just really dependent on the point of wherever they are and their immediate environment. But what I find, at least in my circle and within the interactions that I have, is a lot of the artists subconsciously are actually pushing for social change in my country. We've had COVID, we've had the NSAS protest, which became a global protest, that was really fighting against police brutality. And what I found was a lot of artists found a way to express it through painting, through art, through storytelling, whatever it is, right? So really, I wouldn't say it's the responsibility. I think it's the responsibility for all of humanity to find the way to leave the world better than we met it. Yeah.
Shuk, 2 minutes and 9 seconds.
I think art is a great and effective tool to convey messages and raise awareness. A lot of artists have contributed in that, and it was since the beginning of time, actually. For example, an artist that has come to my mind is Banksy. Banksy has contributed to several issues, which are current issues actually, and I think it was really effective. And because graffiti art has seen a bit, what's the word? Not unreliable. It's effective, but it was a bit. What's the word?
Transient, or it doesn't?
Not transit. Unacceptable in a way during the past time. But I think Banksy has changed it in a way, and in that way it has raised awareness. I think, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
I think something that's unique to music as part of the arts and a form of communication is its accessibility. You don't have to go to a gallery to experience it. We often all have a personal headset. We often listen to it within our private spaces. And we can go back to it and see it again, and listen again and again and again. And each time, depending on the time, the place, the context, the situation that you're in your life, it can have a different profound effect. So I think it's not been the true accessibility of music as a form of art, as a form of communication, should be tapped into. Thanks.
I think also art could speak a lot of things that words cannot explain as well. So it could also convey a lot of messages at the same time.
I was going to ask if anyone had any questions. We don't technically have more time, but if anyone has a burning question, we'll take it. No? Okay. Well then, I'd like to thank all three of you very, very much for being on this panel. And on to the next thing, my colleague Matt Anderson, culture editor of the New York Times, and his panel.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you here this evening. My name is Matthew Anderson. I'm the European culture editor of the New York Times. And it's great to be here in Florence, particularly considering the topic that we have under discussion this evening, which is about private patronage, the role of private money in the arts. Florence, of course, is in a way a cradle of the Renaissance, and it begins, maybe not is kickstarted, but at least is definitely catalyzed by the money of the Medici family, who funded artists, who gave them the freedom to work and to develop and to get going with the Renaissance, which of course changed the whole way that we all understand the world and know it. But one thing that hasn't changed is that the arts still need money. And where does it come from? It's come from a variety of sources over the years, from the church, from royal courts, and from industrial wealth since the Industrial Revolution. But at least here in Europe, particularly since the Second World War, at least in the biggest institutions, we've expected that money to come from the state. But that's changing now, and I think even in some of the biggest institutions, say if you look at the Uffizi or the Louvre, they have commercial partners, and money is coming in from private sources as well. And so I'm glad that we've got some representatives here on the panel from a variety of different private sources of money in the arts. They all have their own perspectives and their own ways of doing it. We have Jana Peel, the head of arts and culture at Chanel, Mariko Silva, the CEO and president of the Henry Luce Foundation, an American charitable foundation, and Patrizio Sandretto Reiro-Mbango, who is a collector of art and also the head of a foundation which has which is known for supporting artists, but also arts education as well. So I want to start by asking you, Jana, in terms of, say if you think about some of your, say, Chanel's competitors like Louis Vuitton or Cartier, they founded their own foundations to have an arts program in their name. Chanel does things a bit differently, and you work with existing institutions. Can you say a bit about why it is that you do it that way, and how you choose your partners, and also what you hope as a company to get out of that?
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Matthew, for that question, and thank you for the pleasure of being here today. It is indeed a tremendous privilege to be able to really steward 100 years of cultural commitment into the next century. And for us, as you say at Chanel, it's a very singular approach, and one that's really based on the spirit of curiosity, generosity, the embrace of the avant-garde that Gabrielle Chanel herself exhibited at the table with Salvador Dali, with Cocteau, with Reverdy, and with the very non-commercial philanthropic support of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring in 1917. So as you say, standing on the shoulders of giants, what does one do 3 years in to come in and really extend that spirit into the next? And so for us, it was about that approach of thinking we do not have the ambition to create our own museums and institutions. We celebrate and honor the incredible institutions, private and public, that exist. So our function is really to think about co-creation with like-minded partners and to really work with the institutions, the people, and the places that embody our company values. And there's the independence. The company, of course, has been in the same family for 5 generations, and there is the ultimate obsession with the freedom of creation. So when we think about who those partners are, the Culture Fund that we launched now 3 years ago was really focused on working with the institutions, be it Centre Pompidou, be it the Power Station of Art in Shanghai or the National Portrait Gallery in London, that were driving the kind of impact that we heard about in the last panel, and thinking about how could Chanel help those people and places go further than they could go themselves. So our themes are very much about foregrounding women. They are about really advancing the new and the next. In that spirit of Gabrielle Chanel, je vais être de ce qui va arriver, what's going to happen next. It's really thinking about the future, as you put it, and also very much activating history to define the future, be it through archives, be it through technology, but really thinking how can we be a partner, how can we create those conditions, and how can we be additive in a way that's long-term and very, very non-transactional in its approach.
Institutions like, say, the Pompidou or the National Portrait Gallery, I mean, these are institutions that have a lot of money behind them already. Why is the decision that you would work with them rather than, say, organizations that, that don't have the cash?
Sure. I mean, Underground Museum was another amazing institution that also fell into that family. And when we look at the cash itself, it often goes to the actual artists themselves. So the next prize, which was a grant that is now in its second year with judges like David Adjaye, Tilda Swinton, Chow Fei, is one which gives unrestricted funding directly to the artists. It works to make sure that their support is enduring, so their creativity lasts. We partner there with the Royal College of Art to make sure that the artists can go through enduring programs. And at a much more local level, there are biennales in Thailand that artists like Cora Crit will be championing, that we will be putting our efforts behind. There will be literary festivals in London. So there are the great institutions whose leaders we really turn to say, Laurent Naban, what is it that's needed here that you can't do yourself? In Paris, it was urbanism, thinking after the museum closes, how can they reopen to audiences that have never known a world without the internet? In China, it was about craft and the next generation of cultural production. In London, it was with Nick Cullinan and a leader who really needed to change the National Portrait Gallery into an institution that didn't just have 19% representation of women. So even though they have the resources, when we open in June after a 3-year project, it's 48% women at the National Portrait Gallery. And to us, that means that we can partner with the great and the good and the smaller, less funded, but also just think how we can work on their needs rather than to promote our own ideology.
Mariko, in America, it's obviously quite a different system where the state doesn't get as involved in the funding of the arts. And trusts and foundations like your own, the Henry Luce Foundation, are important, but also there's much more of a culture of private philanthropy as well. I wonder if, as a sort of observer of both systems, if you could, how do you see, what do you see as the advantages or disadvantages of each way of doing things?
Yeah, so I should say too, I've been on both sides. I've been a fundraiser as well, and I'm the chair of the board of the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, so I see it on the incoming as well as a funder on the outgoing, if you will. And I think from both of those kinds of sources, every institution has to find a balance. The balance for each institution may be different, right? So we tend to think about the gross amount of money, but in fact, the different streams of funding can play off of each other in really productive ways. So if you think about the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in a relatively rural area in Massachusetts, it is an economic engine for the community. It's revitalizing the economy. It's revitalizing tourism in that area. They are bringing in funding from unexpected government sources. So yes, there's the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, but there are also efforts from the federal government and through state government to revitalize the economy. The initial grant to create the Massachusetts Museum for Contemporary Art came from Governor Ben Dukakis, if people remember that. So there is a kind of arc of funding that can shift over time for an institution, including a fledgling and new institution. At the time, of course, when it started, it didn't have money. It wasn't founded like other museums with a large grant to begin with from an individual or a corporation. And so I think you have to take each institution in its turn in terms of what's the right balance. When you think about it at the societal level, one of the functions of the National Endowment for the Arts has always been to seek out those much smaller projects to make sure that there's arts in every community. Of course, you could have a private foundation that has that as a mission, but you can also see how that is makes perfect sense for that to be at the federal level. Right? And so 40%, I believe, still of the NEA money goes through the states and is distributed within the states. And then the overall mission is to spread the wealth, if you will, around the United States. Many foundations and private donors in the US have a particular either regional interest, they might have a particular topical interest. And so if you only let the private money drive the direction of the funding, then you're going to end up with certain kinds of clusters. And I think the key word that you both used is freedom. And so how do we create a funding environment in which artists themselves are not constrained by the funding? Of course, artists are always constrained by the funding because they don't have enough. And arts institutions are always constrained by the funding because they don't have enough. But the work itself should not be constrained by the funding, where the funding comes from. It shouldn't be driven by the funder. And so when we fund, for example, from the Henry Luce Foundation, we are always looking for what is happening in the field. What's of greatest interest in the field? And how can we fund in a way that both spreads the resources around, but also gives opportunities to cohere around particular themes, particular issues, particular contexts that everyone is facing and wrestling with in the arts community, or among, in our case, we focus on museums in particular, so among museums.
Patricia, you're a collector of art. You have a major collection. I think after this we're actually going to go and see some of that at the Palazzo Strozzi. But you also have your own foundation as well. But I want to start by asking a question about, as a collector, I mean, so in terms of, like, we've been talking about institutions, but collectors have always been a way in which private money has funded and supported the art right back to the beginning of the sort of gallery system. But it seems to me that these days the people aren't, or very wealthy people aren't collecting as much, or perhaps not in the same way as well, and that perhaps people are treating it more as a kind of financial investment or a speculation in a way that a kind of traditional model of collector never did. Do you think there's anything that we can do to change this or improve this so that collectors act more in the interest of supporting artists rather than, say, for financial motives?
Yes. Good evening, everybody. First of all, I thank you for inviting me in this occasion that for me is special because, as you say, in Florence now, in Palazzo Strozzi, there is a part of my collection, and so I'm so happy to be here to participate as a collector and also as a president of a non-profit foundation. I have to say that in Italy, the situation also, it's a little bit different talking about art collector. It's true, in the past there were many collectors, but even now there are few collectors. Obviously, now there is a big gap maybe from small collector and then very wealthy, rich people that really can collect in a bigger way. And in Italy, this is true. In fact, the situation is not maybe as was before, but in a certain way, there are so many collectors in the world that this is what is important. Well, I can say that when I started collecting 30 years ago, yes, was quite different the situation than now. And in Italy, especially talking about Italy, we didn't have just the Maxi, our national museum, opened in 2010. And so I have to say that the work that the collector did in the past year was just to support, to buy art, but also to open public spaces for everybody. And so is what I did through my fondazione, but many where, for example, we created a committee where 17 collectors in Italy that we open our foundation, and we work as a public museums. And so I don't believe that there are more or less collectors. It's obviously the world has changed. Now there are wealthy people that they can collect also to invest maybe or to speculate in art, and many other collectors, smaller, maybe that they cannot do that, but they still collect with the idea to support the artists with passion, with love for the art. And what is important at the end is that we go ahead collecting, because really, I don't think that is only a problem in Italy. I can say that in Europe, I know more or less Europe, you have a no-profit foundation also in Spain, and the situation is quite the same. In Europe now, to be an artist is not always easy, and so it's important to have collectors, but what is very important is to have patrons. Collectors that they really want to be involved in the art world, not only buying art, but when it's possible to be involved in the production, in the commission of new works, because it's what really artists now need. It's not only so it's important to go to fair, to galleries and to buy art, but what I think that now make a big difference, it's really try to be involved, if you're a patron, if you're a collector, in producing, commissioning, producing, realizing new works. This for me is the best direction to support.
I guess the question is how involved should the because I think there's always a danger that you say, oh, who pays the piper calls the tune. But Marika, you were talking about freedom. It's obviously something that you think about in terms of the projects that you fund. How do you make sure that you can be, as a responsible funder, that you can be involved but not too involved in a way that would be inappropriate or would work against the freedom of the artist?
Yeah, so I think actually there are a couple of layers to the the freedom question. I think one is about the individual artist, right? If there's a donor who has a relationship with the individual artist, they sort of oversteering, if you will. It can also be the role of the collector, are they oversteering the market? And then, of course, there's the role of a foundation like ours that supports museum exhibitions largely. So we're largely dealing with ideas that are coming to us. And we don't, as a practice or a policy, get in there and say, well, we think you should hang that picture over there, or we think you should reconceptualize the exhibition or whatever, right? We're deferring to the curators always first and foremost. But there's another piece of this, which Patricia touched on, which is the ability for artists to make art as a career and a life. Speaking to the United States context, I mean, you asked about public and private funding, there isn't a lot of public support for whether it's training all the way up through obviously living as an artist in the United States. And so some of the things that we also fund are around creating an economic infrastructure, economic conditions in which artists can be successful. So I think we can think about it from multiple different angles, because if they can't make a life making art, they can't have the space and freedom to think. One of the previous panelists said she's been working so hard she hasn't painted in 3 years. Right? So if that is your driving force and you have something extraordinary to bring to the world through your art, but the economic structures and systems keep you from being able to realize that, I mean, it's long been true, but I think we have to think about it systemically as well as in the individual interaction between funder and artist or funder and institution.
And what I think is interesting actually in terms of best practice, there are so many examples when we look at the States in terms of the spectrum of where that creative endurance is being supported. So projects like Young Arts in America will take children and give grants going into creative education, which we think is one exciting example. Looking at Next Haven, you look at what happens when you come out of arts institution, and we know by definition 19% of artists, I believe, in auctions are coming out of Yale Fine Arts. Down the street, you have Next Haven, artist run, that is being requested in so many cities that can't even scale because there is that focus when coming out of art school, what happens next? I think in the UK, programs like Clore Leadership Foundation have showed us that the leaders themselves at an early stage need that kind of support. And yesterday we were with the director of the National Theatre who had a very enlightened chairman who, sent her to Harvard for a week in terms of cultural leadership, which is quite the exception. And so just looking at some of those models, you think, why is it that you often have business people on arts boards, but very rarely do you have artists on business boards? It's just something to think about with artists like John Latham and the Artist Placement Group. There have been very traditional divides, and I do think in terms of that creative endurance that we need to think much longer term than a sponsorship or a patronage or an event. I think we're all starting or continuing after decades to just make sure that it's not about that old-fashioned way of supporting and sponsoring and entertaining and engaging an event-led philanthropy that I think is evolving.
Patricia, your foundation is also deeply involved in education, particularly teaching sort of literacy about the way in which you can read a work of art involving young people for the first time, maybe exposing to them or teaching them how they can understand something which is maybe neglected in a normal school education. Why did you decide that was an area that you needed to step in? Because usually education we leave that to the state or to private educators.
Yes, I really believe that a patron, a person that believes in art and wants to support the art system have to, obviously, first of all, to support the artist and to produce work and to work with them. But at the same time, you have to pay a lot of attention to education. They need the kids, they really need to be helped in order to understand art. Art is so important, or open really their mind. I see we have more than 30,000 kids that come to Fondazione every year, and I have to say that what they learn through a work of art is something unbelievable. They really open their mind. And so for that, from the beginning, even because when I start collecting, I graduated in economics, so I didn't know anything about arts, and I have to say that was quite difficult at the beginning to understand. And so I say, if I have my foundation, my audience, people that come, have to understand. And so for that, we do a lot of attention to people, to adults, obviously, to people with special needs, because art is so important for people with special needs, not only for everybody, it's important. And then what we do, and I think that it's important too, is mediation, as you say, because when a public come to visit the exhibition in our Fondazione, they have to understand, and so we are our mediators that are always there, ready to dialogue, to create a dialogue between our visitors and the work of art. And so what we are trying to do, and I think that for me it's quite normally, I cannot imagine my life with art, with my artist, and so by art and so on, but at the same time it's something unbelievable when I enter in my Fondazione and I see kids and we see on the Sunday, this is very important too, and I think that it's important to build a museum and put our collection, this is obviously, and now there are many collectors that have created fantastic museums all over the world in order to show the collection. But I think that is not enough. What we have really to do is also to pay attention and to educate the next generation, but also my generation, everybody needs, and this is the direction that we use and we work. I started as a collector, and this is what I'm doing now through the Fondazione. Now are 30 years that I'm doing that. I have to say that really can be a good help for all of us.
I think, from all of us, we've heard of amazing uses of private money in the arts which have made real benefits. And I think at a time when there's a lot of money moving around in the private sector, that can be a great time for the arts. But I just want to, just at the end, think about the sort of corollary that also perhaps it can be a more volatile way to fund yourself. Commercial partners can withdraw suddenly, or in times of downturn, then you are sort of less insulated than you might be at a time of state funding. I just wonder if we could have a think about ways in which organizations can protect themselves or insulate themselves for that. Mariko, I can see you nodding.
So there's a role for the organizations, there's also a role for the funders. I think that I happen to represent an endowed foundation. We're in a wonderful position, and one of the things that we did at the beginning of COVID is we made a whole host, as many endowed foundations did, a whole host of operating grants. We don't generally do in the art space for museums general operating grants, but we knew if we were going to want to fund exhibitions on the other end, there had to be people there. The buildings had to be standing, and so we wanted to make sure that we were able to fund that continuity. And I think, particularly for endowed foundations, there is an opportunity, and in some cases even I would say an obligation or responsibility to be there when the chips are down. I think it's, of course, much easier, and there are many more funders and many more parties to go to and all kinds of things that people participate in when things are going well. But I think there is a responsibility for funders when the chips are down. Ideally, there's as there often is, a state role there as well in kind of smoothing the curve. And then on the institutional side, of course, it's in some level it's very fundamental. You have to budget well and all of those things. But I think it's also being in real communication with your funders. So we try to really build a trusting relationship with our grantees so that they know that they can come to us. One of the questions I always ask grantees is, what is the thing that is not exciting enough for anybody else to fund but you need, and you can't do anything else without it? And if we can put a little money towards that, that's what I want to do.
I think the state comment is very interesting because in many of our countries there are existential needs, which mean that actually the arts are being, in their funding, decentralized, deprioritized, and defunded. So I think it's a really interesting time as well to have those really constructive conversations. We're having them everywhere in the UK, just in terms of appreciating that the government will not provide the answers. We've seen the Arts Council cuts, so I think there's real fascinating moments in terms of really getting close to one's own communities and thinking about what's particularly needed, but the government support is not coming back in the UK in the way that it was. And having been a museum director, you also appreciate that you just have to be so close to your funders, to your donors, but as a funder now on the other side, so close to the needs of your partners that, as you say, you are not there to fund the sexiest project, you are there to fund the project that will be enduring, that will have the kind of cathedral impact that Brunelleschi and the other great architects of the great cities had as they thought what could be enduring for decades, for centuries, for millennia.
We've got time for one or two questions, if there are any from the floor. Nothing? No. Oh, I think we've got some hand mics. Someone will bring you one.
Sorry, I do have a mic. It's
okay. Yeah, hello. Do you think contemporary art have lost a bit its holiness and its respect due to the fast track of artist creation? So the technique have lost a bit of depth and the techniques lost a bit of values. So I wanted to ask Ms. Patrizia, how do they find the right artist with the right technique, and how do they identify the right artist to represent?
So you ask how we do in the Fondazione?
Or actually it's a question for all three. How do you guys see and recognize an authentic artistic technique? And because the issue is there are artists that they have very rich technique, but they can't be successful for some reasons because they are not represented by the right people. Where you find other artists that maybe they have a poor technique of expression, but they manage to sell for millions and millions because they are supported or backed by certain entities. So do you think that the situation, there is a bit of corruption or not really?
No. In my case, I can see we are free. It's a no-profit institution. We are free. So we can just choose the artists because they are good artists. And when I say good artists, it's not a question of media. It can be a painting, can be a sculpture, a video, a film, an installation, a photo, every kind of work. What is important is the content, what the artist is trying to tell us through his work or her work. So this is what and obviously it's important to see many artists, to pay attention, to visit their studio, to understand what there is behind their work, to talk with them. But this is the direction. This is not a question of name, of corporate. I don't buy, as I work with artists very, very young at the beginning of the career, often they start just to have galleries, but not obviously the most important, famous gallery. So in this way, you invite to show an artist or invite an artist that come from a young gallery that is at the beginning of the career. And so obviously you pay attention to his or her work. This depends what you think that is high quality, what is able to capture the future, to talk about the present. So there are obviously the way to understand, but absolutely in the freedom without, it's not a question of corruption or things like that, absolutely. Artists are good as they are good and they grow in the right way. Sometimes we invite artists in the Fondazione that then maybe not disappear but are not the most famous. Other time we invite artists that then in the future, in the year they become more known and they start to have exhibition in museum and so on, but is absolutely in the totally freedom, and this is the best way to find good artists.
I understand.
Add something to that quickly, which is just to say we fund far downstream from the collector and marketplace piece of the art world. We're funding museum exhibitions, but one of the things that we have focused on at the Luce Foundation is really supporting exhibitions of artists who have been under-recognized. We know that there is some bias in the system in terms of who has historically gotten those big museum shows, for example. And so our focus with about 75% of our arts funding is really to bring forward, work with museums who want to bring forward artists who have been under-recognized in the canon.
But are you an artist? Are you an artist?
Me? No, I'm not an artist, but I work with art in a contemporary art gallery.
But if you know young artists that you think that are quite interesting, please send me a mail,
of course.
I'm very happy to look at them.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for.
I will definitely send you, but you know, my only concern was that the content of artists, and sometimes, you know, some artists use some minor issues and causes just for the sake of giving some depth to their art, but not being a real activist. So even there is another question, how do an artist
I'm afraid
become
we
a
don't
real,
have time for any more questions. That's
for
all we've
the
got
next
time for in the official part of the proceedings this evening. So thank you to all of the panelists. But before we head off to the Palazzo Strozzi, I think we've got a little surprise that Kim is going to tell us about.
Yes, just very quickly, thank you very much, first of all, to our panelists and moderators. As everybody knows, we will be heading off to the Palazzo Strozzi to see works from Patrizia's collection in a few moments. But before we do that, we have a special surprise. So if everybody could just, after you applaud our wonderful panel, exit the room and then walk across on this same level to the balcony and look into the Winter Garden. Okay, so just gather around and look in the Winter Garden.
Thank you to Arturo Galanzino,
Thank you.
the director of Palazzo Strozzi.